In December of 1861, on the frost-laden banks of the Mississippi River near Natchez, a woman named Grace committed an act so horrifying that it would be whispered about in parlors and church pews for generations to come, though always in hushed tones, always with the careful omission of certain truths. On Christmas Eve, as candles flickered in the windows of the great house and hymns were being sung in distant quarters, Grace took up a wood-cutting axe and methodically killed her master, Colonel Thaddeus Brennan, and his 4 legitimate sons. The bodies were discovered at dawn on Christmas morning, arranged with a terrible precision that suggested not madness, but a dark and deliberate ceremony. This is not a story of sudden rage or spontaneous violence. This is a story of accumulated suffering, of a system so morally bankrupt that it could transform a human soul into an instrument of retribution, and of the silence that followed, because to speak the full truth would have meant acknowledging the unspeakable foundations upon which the entire edifice of Southern civilization rested. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slaveholding South, stories that reveal what happens when human beings are treated as property and when power encounters no moral boundary. The Brennan plantation stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of rich Mississippi bottomland, producing cotton that filled the holds of ships bound for Liverpool and enriched the family's coffers beyond measure. Colonel Thaddeus Brennan was 53 years old in 1861, a man of considerable education, having attended the College of William and Mary in Virginia, where he absorbed not only classical learning, but also the elaborate philosophical justifications for slavery that circulated among the Southern gentry. He was tall, silver-haired, with the erect bearing of someone accustomed to command, and he spoke with the cultured accent of the planter aristocracy. His wife, Margaret Brennan, had died in 1857 while giving birth to their 5th child, a daughter who survived only 3 days. Margaret's death had sent the colonel into a period of intense religious fermentation, during which he became obsessed with biblical interpretations of patriarchal authority and the notion that a man's seed was sacred, that it must be preserved and multiplied according to God's design. The 4 surviving Brennan sons ranged in age from 18 down to 12. Thaddeus Jr., called Thad, who fancied himself a poet and had published verse in Charleston literary journals. Robert, 16, who managed the plantation's account books with precocious skill. William, 14, silent and studious, already marked for the seminary, and young Edward, 12, still soft-faced and given to collecting insects in glass jars. They were by all accounts refined boys, educated by private tutors, fluent in Latin, and conversant with European history, raised to believe that their position in society was ordained by Providence and that the 237 enslaved people who worked their land were beings of an inferior order, placed by God under their stewardship. Grace had been born on the Brennan plantation in 1835, making her 26 years old in that terrible winter of 1861. Her mother, called simply Ruth, had been a house servant, and Grace inherited not only her mother's striking physical beauty, but also her intelligence and her capacity for silent endurance. Grace was tall for a woman of that time, with high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, and hands that bore the scars of both domestic labor and field work. She had been raised in the great house, trained from childhood to serve the Brennan family with the kind of invisible efficiency that wealthy whites demanded. She could read, having learned secretly from the young Brennan children's discarded primer, though this was a skill she concealed with great care, knowing that literacy in an enslaved person was considered dangerous, even criminal. From the age of 14, Grace had been subjected to Colonel Brennan's nocturnal visits, a pattern that began shortly after his wife fell into the prolonged illness that preceded her death. These visits were never acknowledged in daylight. They existed in a shadow realm where the colonel's actions were simultaneously real and unreal, spoken of by no one, protected by the vast silence that the institution of slavery required in order to function. Grace had borne 3 children by the colonel, though only one survived past infancy, a daughter named Sarah, now 8 years old, whose light skin and features made her parentage obvious to anyone who cared to look, which meant that everyone knew and no one spoke of it. The Gathellow, The trigger for what would unfold came in November of 1861, 2 months before that blood-soaked Christmas Eve. The Confederate States had been at war with the Union for 7 months, and young Thad Brennan had announced his intention to join a Mississippi cavalry regiment, a decision that filled his father with both pride and terrible anxiety. The colonel, watching his oldest son prepare for war, became consumed with an obsessive concern about legacy, about the continuation of the Brennan name and bloodline. In his study one evening, surrounded by leather-bound books and maps of campaigns, he made a decision that would seal all their fates. He summoned Grace to his private chambers and presented her with what he called a sacred duty. She would serve each of his 4 sons in the way she had served him. She would bear children for each of them before they potentially rode off to die in the war, creating a generation that would preserve Brennan blood even if the legitimate line was extinguished on some distant battlefield. He explained this with the calm rationality of a man discussing crop rotation, invoking scripture about concubines and seed, about Abraham and Hagar, about the sacred obligation to multiply. Grace stood before him in the lamplight and said nothing, because what was there to say, because her words had never mattered, because the entirety of her existence had been constructed around the principle that her body was not her own. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. In a system where human beings were classified as property, where the law granted absolute power over another person's body, how could anything approaching consent exist? The colonel believed he was being generous, even noble, ensuring that his sons would know carnal knowledge before facing death, creating a legacy that would survive the war. He never once considered that he was orchestrating a profound violation, that each of his sons would be implicated in an act of rape, that Grace might experience this not as duty, but as an unbearable desecration. This is what slavery did. It corrupted not just labor and economics, but the very capacity to recognize another person's humanity. It made monsters out of men who read poetry and quoted Cicero, who wept at the beauty of sunrise over cotton fields, while remaining utterly blind to the anguish of those who picked that cotton. The colonel established what he called the protocol, a set of rules governing how Grace would be shared among his sons. Each son would have appointed nights, scheduled according to a calendar the colonel himself maintained in a locked drawer of his desk. Grace would continue her daylight duties in the great house, serving meals, tending to laundry, maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. The encounters would take place in a small room behind the kitchen, a space that had once been used for storing preserves, now fitted with a narrow bed and a single lamp. The colonel justified this arrangement by invoking the biblical concept of the kinsman redeemer, arguing that he was preserving his family through extraordinary times, that God would understand the necessity of such measures when civilization itself was under threat. He told his sons that Grace had consented, that she understood the honor being bestowed upon her, that enslaved women often sought such arrangements as it elevated their status and ensured better treatment. Thad, the eldest, accepted this explanation with the naive enthusiasm of an 18-year-old eager to prove his manhood before riding to war. Robert showed more hesitation but ultimately deferred to paternal authority. William, destined for the church, struggled visibly with the theological implications but found comfort in his father's scriptural arguments. Only young Edward seemed genuinely disturbed, but at 12 he was too young and powerless to object, and his discomfort was dismissed as childish squeamishness that would pass with maturity. The protocol began in late November, just after Thanksgiving, a holiday the Brennan family had celebrated with excessive piety, gathering enslaved people before the great house to hear the colonel read from Psalms about God's providence and the proper ordering of the world. Grace remembered standing in that crowd, her daughter Sarah beside her, while the colonel's voice boomed across the lawn about gratitude and divine hierarchy, and she felt something inside her break in a way that could never be repaired. That night, she was summoned to the preserve room for the first time, and the systematic destruction of whatever remained of her interior life began in earnest. Over the following weeks, she moved through the pattern the colonel had established, encountering each son according to the schedule. Thad approached these meetings with a disturbing mix of entitlement and awkward tenderness, as if he believed he was engaging in some kind of courtship. Robert was mechanical and swift, clearly uncomfortable but determined to fulfill what he saw as filial duty. William wept afterward, quoting verses about sin and redemption, making Grace comfort him in his guilt, forcing her to become the instrument of his absolution. Edward, when his turn came, was visibly terrified, and Grace found herself in the grotesque position of having to guide a child through an act that traumatized them both, a memory that would haunt her far more than the others, because in his fear she recognized an echo of her own powerlessness, a reminder that slavery destroyed innocence on all sides of the color line. If you are troubled by these revelations, if these stories of what slavery truly meant disturb you in ways that simple historical narratives rarely do, then this channel is for you. Subscribe to Shadows of the South, where we continue to unearth the hidden testimonies and uncomfortable truths that shape the American experience, because only by facing the full horror of our past can we hope to build a different future. By early December, rumors had begun to circulate among the other enslaved people on the Brennan plantation. Nothing remained secret in a community bound by shared suffering, and though no one spoke openly about what was happening to Grace, everyone understood. An elderly woman named Dinah, who served as midwife and informal spiritual leader among the quarters, tried to offer Grace counsel, tried to remind her that survival was its own form of resistance, that she had to protect herself and her daughter. But Grace had moved beyond the strategies of survival. Something fundamental had shifted in her consciousness. She had begun to understand that there were fates worse than death, that endurance itself could become a form of complicity, and that the only way to reclaim her humanity was through an act so absolute that it would shatter the carefully maintained illusions upon which the entire system depended. In the quarters at night, she would sit with Sarah and tell her stories about a place where people were not owned, where children belonged to their mothers and not to masters, where a woman's body was her own country with borders that could not be crossed without permission. Sarah was too young to fully understand these stories, but she sensed their importance, sensed that her mother was preparing her for something, transferring some essential knowledge that would need to be remembered. The great house began its Christmas preparations in mid-December, following traditions that had been maintained for generations. Evergreen boughs were gathered and arranged throughout the rooms, filling the air with the scent of pine. The colonel ordered a large turkey and a ham to be prepared for the Christmas feast, and he permitted the enslaved people to have their own celebration on Christmas night, a gesture of magnanimity that he believed demonstrated his benevolence. Grace moved through these preparations with an eerie calm that several people later recalled. She fulfilled her duties flawlessly, arranging the greenery, polishing the silver, baking the traditional cakes and pies, all while the protocol continued its inexorable schedule. On December 23rd, she had her final encounter with William, who had brought his Bible and read to her from the Gospel of Luke, the Nativity story, weeping again about sin and redemption, about how Christ came to save all humanity. Grace listened to him and felt nothing, felt so completely emptied out that she had become a vessel awaiting some purpose she herself did not yet fully comprehend. In a society where even love was treated as property, where the bonds between parents and children could be severed by sale, where a woman's body could be distributed among men as casually as livestock, was madness not inevitable? Or was what happened next not madness at all but a terrible sanity, a clear-eyed recognition that some systems are so fundamentally evil that the only moral response is their complete destruction? Christmas Eve arrived with a cold rain that turned the plantation roads to mud and kept most of the enslaved population in their quarters. The Brennan family attended a church service in the early evening, returning home to find Grace had prepared a supper of exceptional quality. They dined together in the formal dining room, the four sons and their father, discussing the war news that had reached them, debating whether Thad should indeed join the cavalry or wait until spring. Grace served them with her characteristic quiet efficiency, refilling glasses, removing plates, disappearing into the kitchen, and reappearing as needed. After supper, the family retired to the parlor, where they sang hymns and read from the Gospel of Matthew, the story of the wise men following a star. At 10 o'clock, the colonel announced it was time for bed, reminding his sons that they would need to rise early for Christmas morning services. The young men ascended the stairs to their rooms on the second floor. The colonel remained in his study for an hour longer, reviewing papers related to the plantation's cotton yield and making notes in his ledger. Grace cleaned the dining room and kitchen, banking the fires, extinguishing most of the lamps, performing the final tasks of her day. At midnight, while the house slept under a sky heavy with winter stars, Grace retrieved the wood-cutting axe from the tool shed behind the kitchen. It was a tool she had used countless times for mundane purposes, splitting kindling for the stoves, a familiar weight in her hands. She carried it into the great house through the back entrance, moving with absolute silence up the servants' stairs to the second floor. She went first to young Edward's room, the 12-year-old, who slept curled on his side like a child still, and what she did there she did swiftly, sparing him consciousness of his end. She moved next to William's chamber, and then to Robert's, and then to Thad's, each time executing her purpose with a terrible efficiency that suggested she had rehearsed these movements in her mind until they had become ritual. Finally, she descended to the first floor and entered the colonel's study, where he had fallen asleep in his chair, his head tilted back, the ledger still open before him. When she brought the axe down upon him, she whispered words that no one would ever know, words that were hers alone, a final statement that history would never record. The discovery came at dawn when the cook, an elderly enslaved woman named Hattie, arrived to begin preparations for Christmas breakfast, and found the back door standing open and bloody footprints tracked across the kitchen floor. Her screams brought people running from the quarters, and what they found in the great house would become the stuff of nightmares and legends. The 5 bodies were arranged with a symmetry that was almost ceremonial. The colonel sat upright in his study chair, his face frozen in an expression of surprise. Each son lay in his own bed, hands folded across the chest, as if arranged for burial. The axe had been washed clean and returned to its place in the tool shed. Grace was found sitting on the front steps of the great house, wearing a clean white dress she had taken from the attic where Margaret Brennan's clothes were stored, her daughter Sarah sitting beside her, both of them watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The immediate aftermath was chaos. A rider was sent to fetch the sheriff from Natchez, though everyone understood that legal proceedings in such a case would be perfunctory at best. Under the laws of Mississippi, Grace had destroyed property of immense value, she had murdered a prominent citizen and his heirs, she had committed the ultimate crime that the slave system was designed to prevent and punish. But she had also created a problem, because to try her in court would require testimony about why she had done what she did, and that testimony would necessarily reveal the colonel's protocol, the systematic rape of an enslaved woman that he had orchestrated and forced his sons to participate in. The revelation of such facts would not exonerate Grace. The law afforded her no such defense, but it would permanently stain the Brennan name, and by extension raise uncomfortable questions about the behavior of other plantation families, about the open secret that slave-owning was not just about labor, but about sexual dominion, about the thousands of mixed-race children who testified to the routine violation of enslaved women. The sheriff, a man named Beauregard Kinsey, who had been a friend of Colonel Brennan's, arrived by midday on Christmas. He found the bodies, he interviewed the enslaved witnesses, and he sat for a long time with Grace in the parlor, where the evergreen boughs still hung, their pine scent now mingled with the metallic odor of blood that had seeped through the ceiling from the rooms above. He asked her why she had done it, and she told him the truth in a flat, effectless voice, describing the protocol, the scheduled violations, the colonel's biblical justifications. Kinsey listened with a face that grew increasingly gray, and when she finished, he sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he told her that she would hang, that there was no possibility of any other outcome, but that the official record would state she had killed the family in a fit of madness brought on by demonic possession, because that was a narrative everyone could accept, that preserved the necessary fictions, that allowed the system to continue functioning. Grace nodded, having expected nothing different, and asked only that her daughter be sold far from Mississippi to someone who might treat her kindly, because Sarah was not yet visibly marked by the protocol and still had some chance at a life less brutal. The execution was carried out on December 30th, with unusual swiftness, because the longer Grace remained alive, the more her story might spread, the more questions might be asked. A scaffold was erected in the town square of Natchez, and Grace was hanged before a crowd of several hundred people who had gathered to witness the spectacle. The official notice in the Natchez Courier reported that a Negro woman named Grace had murdered her master and his family while under the influence of demonic forces, and that justice had been served. The paper made no mention of the protocol, of the systemic rape that had been its cause. The Brennan plantation was sold at auction to settle the estate's debts, and the enslaved people were dispersed among various buyers. Sarah, Grace's 8-year-old daughter, was purchased by a Methodist minister from Tennessee who kept her as a house servant and treated her with relative decency, though she would live the rest of her life under the shadow of her mother's name, carrying a legacy of violence and resistance that she could never fully articulate or escape. What happened to Grace of Mississippi was not an isolated incident, but rather an extreme manifestation of the violence inherent in a system built on human ownership. The protocol that Colonel Brennan established was unusual only in its explicitness. In the formal calendar he kept in his locked drawer, the reality it represented, the routine sexual exploitation of enslaved women by masters and their sons, was a foundational element of slavery itself, woven so deeply into the fabric of Southern society that it barely warranted comment. The thousands of light-skinned children born into bondage testified to this fact, though the official narratives carefully avoided acknowledging what everyone knew. Grace's response, her act of total annihilation, was remarkable not because enslaved people never resisted, but because most resistance took forms that were less visible, less conclusive. People poisoned masters slowly, they committed acts of sabotage, they ran away, they found small ways to preserve dignity and claim autonomy. Grace chose instead an act of such finality that it could not be ignored or dismissed, an act that forced the community to confront, however briefly, the truth of what slavery meant. There is a small cemetery outside Natchez where the Brennan family is buried, 5 graves in a row beneath a single marble monument that describes them as victims of a terrible crime. There is no marker for Grace, who was buried in an unmarked grave outside the town limits, in the section reserved for criminals and paupers, but her story persisted in the oral tradition of black communities throughout Mississippi, passed down through generations as both warning and testimony, a reminder that there were limits to endurance, that some forms of suffering inevitably produce rage that cannot be contained. In the decades after the Civil War, when formerly enslaved people were interviewed about their experiences, many spoke about the sexual violence that had been an unremarkable feature of their lives, about the children born from rape who were sold away from their mothers, about the complete absence of legal protection or recourse. Grace's story fit into this larger pattern, though her response did not. Most people survived by whatever means they could,
and carried their trauma silently into freedom. Grace refused survival on those terms, and chose instead to destroy the source of her torment, knowing that she would die for it, but preferring that death to continued submission. The question of Grace's mental state has been debated by the few historians who have examined her case. Was she insane, as the official record claimed, driven to madness by prolonged abuse, or was she entirely rational, making a calculated decision to end not just her own suffering, but to eliminate the threat that Brennan men posed to other women, including potentially her own daughter, as she grew older? The answer likely contains elements of both. Trauma of the kind Grace endured does fracture consciousness, does create states that cannot be easily categorized as sane or insane, but her actions showed planning and purpose, a clarity about what she wanted to accomplish, and how to accomplish it. She killed the 4 sons because they were being shaped into the same kind of men their father was, because the protocol had already begun their transformation from boys who might have possessed some capacity for moral perception into masters who believed they owned, not just the labor, but the very flesh of those they enslaved. She killed the colonel because he was the architect of her destruction, because he had justified his actions with scripture and reason, because he represented the system in its most refined and educated form, proving that culture and learning were no barrier to fundamental evil. The civil war that the Brennans had worried about, the conflict that had motivated the colonel's obsessive concern with legacy, continued for another 3.5 years after Grace's execution. By April of 1865, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the institution of slavery had been destroyed, not by moral enlightenment, but by military defeat and political necessity. The Brennan plantation passed through several owners and was eventually subdivided, its original boundaries erased by time and development. Today, if you drive through Warren County, Mississippi, you might pass within miles of where the great house once stood without knowing it, without any marker to indicate that anything of significance occurred there. This erasure is intentional, part of the larger project of Southern memory that sought to replace the reality of slavery with nostalgic myths of gentility and benevolence, stories about faithful servants and kind masters that bore no resemblance to the actual historical record. Grace's story is one that such narratives could never accommodate because it revealed too much, because it insisted on naming what was supposed to remain unspoken. When we examine cases like Grace's, when we force ourselves to confront the full reality of what slavery was, and what it did to people on all sides of the racial divide, we must resist the temptation to make it symbolic or abstract. These were real people, born and dying in specific places at specific times, making choices within circumstances that were not of their making. Grace was not a metaphor or an archetype. She was a woman who experienced particular sufferings, and who responded to those sufferings in a way that she believed was necessary. The Brennan men were not simply villains in a morality play. They were human beings who were shaped by a society that taught them from birth that they were superior, that their desires should be unlimited, that the people they owned existed to serve their needs. The tragedy is not just that Grace killed them, but that the system made her killing them seem like the only possible response to an impossible situation, that there existed no mechanism for justice or accountability that could have intervened before events reached their terrible conclusion. Slavery was not a singular evil, but a compound of evils, each reinforcing the other. It was economic exploitation, but it was also sexual violence. It was physical brutality, but it was also psychological warfare. It was legal oppression, but it was also theological corruption, a perversion of religious faith that used scripture to justify the unjustifiable. Colonel Brennan, reading from the Bible while orchestrating his protocol, represents the complete moral bankruptcy of a system that could make even sacred texts into instruments of domination. his sons participating in that protocol, with varying degrees of discomfort but uniform obedience, shows how thoroughly evil can be normalized when it is embedded in the structures of daily life. And Grace's response, her Christmas Eve massacre, reveals what happens when human beings are pushed beyond all limits, when the choice becomes not between right and wrong, but between dignified death and degraded survival. These stories reveal the true price of power exercised without moral constraint, and they remind us that the South's defeat in the Civil War did not erase this legacy. The trauma of slavery reverberated through generations, shaping family structures, economic opportunities, psychological resilience, and social relationships in ways that persist into the present. Grace's daughter Sarah lived into the 20th century, dying in 1923 in Memphis, Tennessee, having never spoken publicly about her mother but having passed the story down to her own children in whispered conversations. Those descendants still live in Mississippi and Tennessee today, carrying a history that is both uniquely theirs and tragically common, one story among thousands that collectively constitute the hidden history of American slavery. To study these stories is not to indulge in morbid curiosity or to assign collective guilt, but to understand how systems of oppression function, how they corrupt everyone they touch, and how their consequences echo across time. Grace of Mississippi deserves to be remembered not as a monster or a martyr, but as a human being who was broken by an inhuman system, and who responded with an act that was simultaneous in assertion of her humanity and a destruction of her future. Her story is uncomfortable because it cannot be resolved into easy lessons or redemptive conclusions. It simply stands as testimony to what happened when people were treated as property, when power acknowledged no limits, and when the veneer of civilization concealed a reality of systematic violence that eventually demanded a terrible accounting. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you understand that we can only move forward by honestly confronting what came before, then share this video and join this community dedicated to unearthing the truths that were buried by time and will be forgetting. Because Grace's story is not just about the past but about the present we have inherited and the future we still have the power to shape.